The castle might look grand from the outside, with its towering stone walls and banners fluttering in the wind. Inside, the lords and ladies dine on silver platters and sip wine from goblets carved with precious stones. But if you stepped behind the thick oak doors of the great hall and descended into the shadowy corridors of the service quarters, you'd find a very different world. Down there, hidden from the finery and fanfare, lived the invisible gears of medieval life, the servants. And believe it or not, you'd never want to be one. Life as a medieval servant was not a life of quiet stability or domestic routine. It was a brutal mix of exhaustion, obedience, and constant risk. Your day would begin before the sun had stretched its arms across the sky. It's often around 4 or 5 in the morning, and it would not end until long after your masters had gone to bed. While they slept in feathered comfort, you might be scrubbing soot from a stone floor, hauling buckets of water from a well, or clearing out chamber pots filled with the unmistakable stink of privilege. You didn't live in your own cozy quarters. You lived in a narrow wooden bed tucked into a hallway, or tucked near the kitchen hearth. Privacy was a luxury no one thought you needed. You rose when the bell rang, dressed in the same rough tunic and apron you wore every day, and began the chores you knew by heart and by muscle memory. There were no days off, no sick leave, no slow mornings. Depending on your role, your tasks could vary from endlessly repetitive to outright dangerous. A scullery maid, often the lowest rung of the servant ladder, had to clean greasy pots and soot blackened pans with sand and ashes, scrubbing for hours on end until her hands cracked and bled. Kitchen boys were expected to run errands, turn spits of roasting meat over open flames, and taste food for poison. Yes, that was sometimes part of the job. One bite too many, and you might be dead before the roast reached the Lord's table. If you worked in the laundry, your job was no easier. Washing clothes meant boiling water over fire, hauling it in heavy iron pots, and scrubbing garments by hand with lye or harsh soap. The work was hard, hot, and thankless. You were expected to handle the Lord's silk tunic with the same care you gave to his muddy underclothes. You make a mistake, and you'd feel the consequences, possibly in the form of a beating or dismissal. And then there were the chamberlains, those who worked closest to the noble family. At first glance, this may seem like a promotion. You get to dress the Lord, prepare his bed, arrange his daily schedule. But the pressure was immense. You had to anticipate every mood and every whim. If the Lord wanted his wine at a specific temperature or his shoes warmed by the fire and you failed, the punishment could be swift and public. Servants were considered property, expendable, and easily replaced. Physical punishment was a daily threat. A slap across the face, a kick, or even flogging could be your reward for dropping a dish or speaking out of turn. The master's word was law, and you had no rights. Even being falsely accused by another servant could lead to severe consequences, especially if your accuser had the ear of the master or mistress. The conditions were no better. Castles were cold, damp, and drafty. Fires were reserved for the great hall and the noble chambers. Servants had to make do with layers of rough wool and the warmth of crowded sleeping quarters. Illness spread quickly, especially with poor sanitation. If you caught a fever, you still worked. If you coughed up blood, you still worked. If you couldn't walk, you were carried to your post or left to die. Food was another daily reminder of your low status. While your lord dined on roasted boar, spiced pies, and imported fruits, you made do with crusts of bread, pottage, and whatever was left from the noble table. Often bones, fish heads, and half-eaten scraps. Meals were rushed and rarely satisfying. Hunger was a constant presence, and yet you had to cook for people who never once went without. Perhaps the cruelest part of being a medieval servant was the illusion of proximity to power. You stood next to the lady as she braided her hair, waited at the Lord's elbow during banquets. You even rocked the baby heir to sleep in your arms. But you were never seen as an equal. You could dedicate your entire life to serving a single family and die without so much as a gravestone to mark your name. And yet for many, servitude was the best option available. For a peasant's child, entering service was sometimes seen as a step up. It meant regular meals, shelter, and perhaps a chance to rise through the household ranks. A clever boy might become a steward. A hard-working girl might catch the eye of a merchant and secure a marriage out of poverty. But these stories were rare. Most servants remained servants until their backs broke and their hands grew too gnarled to lift a bucket. Some servants weren't even volunteers. Children could be sold into service by desperate parents. Orphans were taken in by noble houses, not out of charity, but for labor. Others were indentured, working off debts they could never hope to repay. These men and women had no say in where they lived or whom they served. Their freedom was a dream, slowly slipping further out of reach with every sunrise. Then there were the court servants, the ones who worked in royal palaces. Their jobs came with more polish but no less pressure. Court was a place of ceremony and hierarchy. One wrong word or glance could destroy your position. You had to be invisible, yet always available, emotionless, yet ever polite. You stood through endless feasts, tended to guests who never learned your name, and smiled while your knees trembled from exhaustion. Still, within this bleak world, moments of humanity existed. Servants formed deep bonds with one another, creating surrogate families in the kitchens and halls. They whispered gossip in dark corners, laughed over spilled ale, and cried quietly over the death of a fellow worker. They shared advice, saved crusts of bread for one another, and stood together when the lash fell unjustly. These small acts of kindness were the glue that kept them from breaking entirely. There were also occasional masters who showed mercy or treated their servants with respect. A fair mistress might let a maid rest on feast days. A generous lord might offer coin for extra work. But these were exceptions, not rules. Most saw their servants as tools, useful but ultimately replaceable. Being a servant meant disappearing behind the curtain of history. No one wrote down your story. No one carved your name in stone. You lived in silence and served without thanks. Yet without you, the castles would not have run. The nobles would not have eaten, and the entire grand illusion of medieval life would have collapsed. So next time you wander through a medieval reenactment or marvel at a noble feast in a movie, think of the young boy turning the spit behind the wall, sweat pouring down his soot-streaked face. Think of the girl in the laundry room, her hands raw from boiling water. Think of the chambermaid rising in the dark to light a fire she herself will never sit beside. That was their world, cold, unforgiving, and invisible. You wouldn't want to be a medieval servant, not for a day, not for an hour. It was not a life of comfort or even of dignity. It was a life of relentless labor, constant fear, and silent endurance. But in their quiet suffering, these servants formed the foundation of a world that often forgot they existed. Their strength was never praised, but it was real. Their stories were never sung, but they mattered. And now, centuries later, perhaps it is finally time we remembered them. Now that you've stepped into the shoes of a medieval servant, even for a few minutes, you can probably feel the weight of their world pressing down. The endless labor, the icy stone floors, the scalding water for laundry, and the ever-watchful eyes of the lords above you. There were no rewards, no applause, and certainly no days off. Life wasn't just hard. It was survival wrapped in obedience and silence. Every task was a risk. Every mistake could cost you your position, your health, or worse. These were people who lived in the shadows of castles, whose hands built feasts they never tasted, and whose sweat polished the silver that would never be theirs. And while history often forgets them, their toil was the invisible thread holding society together. Without them, the grandeur of the medieval world would have crumbled. So the next time you admire the elegance of a medieval banquet or the pomp of royal life, spare a thought for the quiet souls behind the curtain. If you enjoyed this journey through the darker corners of the past, be sure to like, subscribe, and join us next time as we reveal more untold truths from history. Their stories deserve to be remembered.